Hi, everyone. Whoa, this mic works. My name is Heijin Lee. I'm an assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies. Thank you. Uh, and I'd like to welcome you to the Critical BTS Reader Book Launch Hawaii Edition. Yes, that deserves applause. We launched this book at Berkeley a couple months ago. And later in 2025, we'll be launching it in Boston. So I'm so glad that we are able to celebrate the release of this book here in Hawaii. This book launch is possible by the collaboration and sponsorship of several departments: Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies. We have a monthly colloquium that we do together. And of course, under co-sponsorship from the Center of Korean Studies that has generously provided the space and refreshments. So I really want to thank the Center. Asian Studies is also a co-sponsor of this event. So thank you to everyone who contributed. So for today's event, we are going to give you all a little overview of the book by the co-editors, an introduction to the book, and then each of us is going to talk about our contributions to the book very briefly. We want this to be more of a talk story than a talking to, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and we'll have some time for book buying and signing, as it were. So that will be our itinerary for today. We are lucky to have two co-editors here with us who have flown all the way from Berkeley and Toronto. First, I'd like to introduce Michelle Cho, who is an assistant professor of Korean media and cinema studies at the University of Toronto. She is co-editor of Mediating Gender in Post-Authoritarian South Korea and author of the forthcoming monograph, Genre Worlds, Global Forms, and Millennial South Korean Cinema. Michelle is a frequent commentator on Asian media in outlets ranging from NPR to the CBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and the Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming Michelle. And now I'd like to introduce Vernadette Gonzales, who is professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. She is the author of Securing Paradise, Tourism and Militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines, Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper, and co-editor of Detours, a decolonial guide to Hawaii. And I'm sure, as most of you know, Vernadette was a very beloved faculty member here at UH, and so we are so happy to welcome her back for this event. Okay, great. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to the co-editors of the book, who will give us an overview and an introduction after they figure out how to wear their lei. This is important. So I'd like to turn it over to our co-editors for an introduction to the book.
So we were asked to kind of cover or tell the story of how the book came together. There's a little bit of delay. Okay. So this book came about because of basically enjoyment in a beautiful K-pop group called BTS. And we're all coming to this enjoyment from different timelines. Michelle is much earlier fan than I am. And we were scholars and teachers doing all different kinds of work, not necessarily Korean media or performance studies, but I'm more of somebody who does Asian American cultural studies, for instance. And we were really interested in thinking about putting together a reader about BTS that captured not sort of like a tell-all story about BTS, but rather a way to think through how different communities might approach or grapple with BTS as a phenomenon. So that was what our sort of formative thought was. And we were all part of some group chat where we would share memes and little clips of BTS just out of pure love for the group. And then I think it was just a conversation about, has anyone put together a book about BTS that's a scholarly book that gets us to understand this phenomenon, right, as a global cultural kind of thing. And it turned out that there hasn't been that much done that collects this stuff as a book. And so we figured, well, why not us? Why not us? So that's why we're here.
Yeah, I think it's also like I can hear you sitting next to you, but then I hear you through the microphone. So, are you guys hearing okay? Okay, great. Yeah, so I joined the project after it had been conceived in these group chats and things because I was also seeing all of this activity around BTS, and I've been following like K-pop's growing popularity in North America and other places outside of Asia for a while. And BTS was doing something pretty special and significant. And so I was really curious about how people were understanding what the group signified, especially around 2017, which we all know is, that was the beginning of the Trump presidency, first Trump presidency. And it really struck me that the kind of discussions and conversations that BTS was inspiring at the time were kind of moving in the opposite spirit almost from the kind of xenophobic, trying to define what's properly American, the kind of thing that was happening in the political sphere. And so I found that super interesting. And then I think out of that, the excitement around the group was just infectious, and you could see it as this truly global phenomenon. So we have the table of contents so that you can just see a bit of the range of different types of essays and approaches to BTS in the reader. Because it's a really interdisciplinary project, and it's something that we wanted from the start to be academic, but not just limited to kind of like academic analysis, but giving space to people who wanted to write about BTS, who might be in academia, not in academia, inspired by BTS for a variety of reasons to explore different aspects of identity, just the relationship between culture and society. We also have some fan artists in the volume. So we're really trying to do this work of giving a bit of a sense of how many different approaches you can take to BTS.
Oh, so just backing up, that first section in the book really covers the sonic, choreographic, visual aesthetics and genealogies that inspire BTS's work, their music, their dancing, their even the way that they sort of exist in an idol industry, right? All those things are produced by different kinds of genealogies. And so it's also produced in anticipation of a global audience, right? So it draws from global traditions, not just South Korean traditions, and it anticipates that sort of dialogue back with a global audience. And so this syncretism is born of empire, of global exchanges, right? And so we try to capture that in this section. So, you know, you can kind of see the different kinds of essays that are in this section.
Yeah, in part two, we're looking at the way that BTS is this transmedia phenomenon. So what we mean by that is that, yes, they're a boy group, a K-pop idol group, which is an ensemble of performers that, you know, sing and dance. But they also create worlds across different media forms. And so there's a lot of discussion of the way that like the Korean wave or Korean popular culture, what's now referred to as K culture, as a kind of nationally branded type of media, it really takes advantage of the way that digital media and platforms work. And so this is also the section where we talk about how important those technological changes were to the growing popularity of the group. And so it's not just that like social media, video sharing, you know, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, it's not just that they help people spread the content, but also they give people a space to express their own relationship to the group and also meet each other. So this is where the kind of fan communities are also described. And so we have essays on fanfic, on, you know, just different forms of media, which are avenues for people to connect with each other and with the group.
So part 3 of the book is really about geopolitics in BTS, right? How do different fan communities use the material and message of BTS, right, to their own ends? And it's really about grappling with specific conditions in different places, right? So we have a number of contributors in this section who cover sites from you know, Turkey to the Philippines, right? And thinking through how the fandom in these places really gravitate towards BTS and sort of translate the capaciousness of their message, right, to their own specific political context. And so often BTS themselves are sort of limited in the kind of political explicitness of what they can say, especially in Korea about Korean politics. But I feel that there's a way in which ARMY takes up where BTS leaves off because of the roominess of the message that they create. So that's what this section is about.
Yes, and then we have a final section, part 4, that is focused on fan communities. And so there are accounts from individual fans and talking about what BTS has meant to them or how this encounter with BTS and its ARMY fandom has helped them to come to terms with some aspect of their identity or work through various challenges. There's also a strong imprint in the book overall of the pandemic. And this as a kind of collective experience, collective trauma in a lot of ways. And BTS's popularity during the pandemic era is really remarkable and I think says a lot about what fandom could provide in this context. So that's where we go in that section. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit about, I don't know, I prepared too many slides, so I'm just going to breeze through them and skip a lot of things, but this is just a bit of a kind of summary, I guess, of the different ways that we thought that BTS could serve as a lens to think about and maybe think about in new ways a variety of topics that we all as scholars are interested in researching and teaching, and also to validate, I think, what a lot of fans already knew, which is that, the fandom of BTS isn't just an escapist kind of, diversion, but it's actually a way to think seriously about all of these topics. So, if you're studying popular culture or global cultures, the growing impact of Asian cultures in a global context, BTS is a perfect case study. It's clearly related to the way that people in the Asian diaspora can understand their relationship perhaps to Asia and Asian culture. As a Korean studies scholar, someone who specializes in South Korea, they're also a really interesting way to think about how culture is translated and what's being received. From a kind of media studies lens, they're a really fascinating phenomenon for the reasons I was talking about a little earlier, the way that they kind of expand across all of these different media forms. And in terms of performance, they are well known for being just these incredible physical performers. And so we have a dance studies scholar as one of the members of the editorial collective who's able to bring out the kind of richness of their choreographic repertoire. And then as Heijin's going to talk about in her essay and in other essays that are represented, there's a lot that BTS can open up about thinking about gender, sexuality, just the way that gender identity, it's important to have a representative in the pop cultural space that offers new possibilities for thinking about these identities. Yes, I'm going to just quickly move. I have a few screenshots of news pieces that really kind of emphasize the political potential that people were finding in Army fandom. Again, this is in the pandemic era. You may remember news stories about Army trolling Trump for his Tulsa, Oklahoma rally. A lot of youth activism emerging around BTS fandom and K-pop fandom at large. So K-pop fans kind of hijacking white supremacist hashtags and trying to kind of act as a collective to combat the use of online spaces as organizing spaces for this anti-racist social justice project. So that was definitely a big inspiring point that helped us to also think about BTS's potential. I'm going to turn things over now to Heijin to talk about the essay that she contributed to the reader, which is fantastic. And we're moving into the section where we're going to each kind of give you a preview of our essays.
All right, if you're here because you wanted to see pictures of cute boys, this is your time. This is it. I'm delivering. Okay, so my essay is called Gender Does Not Exist Outside of Patriarchy, Flower Boys, Gender Envy, and the Radical Possibilities of Jimin Gender. So on October 10th, 2020, BTS live streamed a concert, and there were all kinds of photos of Park Jimin that went viral because on his left hand, he had the word arcanus, and on the right, illicebra. Illicebra is Latin for enticement and is a feminine noun. The internet taught me a lot of things. And arcanus is a masculine noun that means keeper of secrets. North American Army was really blown away by this. There were a multitude of tweets. This one, I think, says it best. it says, the fact that Illicebra is a feminine term and Arcanus is masculine blows my mind. Jimin really said Jimin gender. And so I saw this and I thought to myself, what the heck is Jimin gender? And why is it so meaningful for North American Army, right? So I'm really interested in how Jimin travels and what the North American lens, is, right? What makes him and this gender so special? What does it mean? So looking through these tweets, it's clear that Jimin gender is an alternative to hegemonic masculinity and femininity. There's all kinds of tweets talking about how there's a duality in Jimin and BTS members, right? They are both feminine and masculine, and that this is something lacking in hegemonic American popular culture. So this one juxtaposes his beautiful face with the description, the masculine man, right? And so there is this sort of contradiction or tension that the poster is trying to illuminate. And in saying that this kind of soft masculinity is indeed masculine. But this queering depends on decontextualizing Jimin's gender performance, right? So in North America, fans tend to assume that this soft masculinity correlates to him being non-binary, or they make assumptions about his sexuality. And this kind of soft masculinity is a hallmark of K-pop, right? Because it's so different from what has been presented to us in American popular culture. But if you look to Asia, this flower boy, the Gomminam, has been around since the late 1990s. It's a hallmark, like a staple of Korean and Japanese popular culture, and is really not about any sort of, sexuality, right? It's firmly masculine and heterosexual. So it's really important to understand that North American fans are really reading Jimin through this kind of racialized and gendered lens that is particular to the North American context, in which Asian men are always more feminized compared to white men and black men. This is not lost on entertainment companies, though, right? So I point out in the essay that this is a very intentional shift that happens with BTS's presentation. So if you look at them around 2014, they're like B-boys, they're like very hip-hop. It's Jimin on the left, shaking hands with sort of flower boy Jimin, right, which emerges a few years later. And this is a very conscious choice that's being made on the part of the entertainment company to capitalize on the expectations of global fans. Now, this is fan art, by the way, right? So the fans love this, they acknowledge this, and there is no sort of contradiction between sort of old Jimin and new Jimin. So what I found looking through these tweets, and what makes BTS, I think, remarkable, is that we're so used to boy bands, and young people love boy bands, but they often want to be with their favorite boy band members. And what I argue in this essay is actually many of these fans want to be Jimin. They don't want to be with him; they want to be him. Right? These tweets reveal gender envy, right? They want to be Jimin gender. They want his gender. So in this way, Jimin may not change the structures of gender inequality, but his gender performance gives North American Army a kind of visual language for how to reshape and reimagine theirs, right? So this tweet says, Jimin has one job, and that's to feed trans people gender envy, right? And there's just a multitude of these tweets. This is really salient in light of our recent election, right? I don't know if you guys have been tracking the news, but apparently searches for searches about the 4B movement, which is a feminist movement in South Korea that rejects marriage, dating, sex, right, and having children. These searches have spiked since last Tuesday, right? And so there's many ways in which Korean society, culture are offering alternatives, right, to North American young people and fans. And I think this is a good example of how that begins. So finally, my last slide is of the show Run BTS. They had a reality show many years ago. And this fan posts this exchange between them. They're taking a selfie. And at the end, Jimin says, "There you go again, what the heck is men?" And then the fan says, "Jimin really said, fuck gender stereotypes." That's not really what he said. But what is important here is this projection, right, that the fans have, that he really symbolizes a world in which these gender binaries don't exist. So BTS allows us to imagine that our idols are not merely our fantasy love interests, but rather the harbingers of radical revolutions to come. So thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Michelle, who will talk about her piece.
Yeah, so I wrote an essay that focused on my favorite BTS song, which is called Pomna, or Spring Day. So I talk about how this song is widely understood within ARMY fandom as a song about this Hewell ferry disaster, which is a tragic event that occurred in 2014, in which a ferry that was making a pretty standard trip from the kind of mainland of the peninsula to Jeju Island sank, and over 300 people died, 250 roughly of whom were high school students. So they were on a school trip. What's really shocking about this incident is that the accident happened in calm waters. There was reporting that everybody had been rescued, but ultimately what led to the deaths of all of these passengers was a really poorly uninformed crew, a rescue mission that had a very unclear chain of command. So people were not jumping into action, but they were waiting for some kind of higher authority to tell them what to do. In the meantime, the ferry was sinking, and what was revealed was that the ferry was overloaded to an illegal extent. And so it had tipped over because safety regulations were not being enforced. It's kind of a sign of the way that the regulatory system fails in the South Korean context. And it led to, a real kind of soul-searching moment, I think, but a lot of frustration because there's a lot of corruption and collusion that prevented any kind of real reckoning with what had occurred. So it kind of exists as a national trauma for the public. So it's really interesting that fans understand this song to be a kind of tribute because I would argue that it then offers some space to memorialize the victims of this event. It offers a kind of opportunity to teach people about what occurred, but it does this in the form of a pop song and a music video, which is kind of interesting. So I'm trying to argue that, even a pop cultural text can actually serve in a way as a memorial And so the essay kind of looks at, how I come to that conclusion. And so I look at the way that the song, so it's still, I think, one of the most popular singles in South Korea. It kind of stays in the charts, and people really turn to it, I think. It's also a song that kind of circulates through the fandom through these explainer videos. So this fan-made video, What You Still Don't Know About BTS Spring Day, is one of the examples of fan-made videos in which fans are teaching each other about the various references in the music video and how to interpret the music video in relation to Seoul. And then that proliferates in reaction videos that fans will film where they are watching a video like this and then they are learning about what happened and they're expressing sadness and emotion and a kind of, there's this transitive effect of the kind of learning and the empathy that is produced by this kind of text. So some of the examples of this in this fan-made video of the way that fans are using different skills of kind of analyzing the aesthetics of the video and linking it up to media imagery and media texts about the ferry. There's a lot of really creative ways that fans are doing this kind of like close reading practice. So the author of this fan-made video is clearly motivated. This is Italian Army is the username that this person uses on YouTube. They've clearly been motivated to seek out as much information in the news media about the Seoul disaster as they can and use that information to then parse the video and make these connections. So for instance, between this television news footage and the porthole in the Spring Day music video. So it's kind of this like popular practice of aesthetic analysis that I find really fascinating. But then, there's a lot of ways that I think about Spring Day as offering an example of how popular culture, popular media can actually, make these larger global forces that are leading to an incident like this visible or somehow perceptible, that we can see the work that popular culture can do to spur this kind of analysis because fans are making the connection between like neoliberal deregulatory regimes that led to this kind of risky, again, modifying of the ferry and overloading of cargo, and then having a crew that was basically composed of like temporary workers who have no training, safety training. Like they're connecting the dots and understanding that these are results of larger global forces that are increasing risk or privatizing risk and making, really leading to these conditions where you can have a disaster like this, even in a so-called, developed country like South Korea. So I think about this in terms of cognitive mapping, like that in a text like Spring Day, you can start to see the pieces of the kind of social forces that can lead to this outcome. I'm also really interested in how, public mourning or memorial cultures are a topic that have been discussed in relation to a lot of incidents and events, especially from the 20th century onwards. But there are often debates about how effective public memorials can be if the incidents are immediately kind of converted into a case of national injury, as opposed to focusing on the ways that, like, there's a variety of different factors involved that impact what individuals are experiencing. And so there are lots of examples of this in the Asian context. And so what would it mean to kind of think about, again, the pop cultural text as memorial, as a way to open up beyond a kind of stable, victim witness position, or like the idea that only the state and official histories, official accounts can be the repository of some kind of memorial culture. So yeah, that's my essay in a few minutes.
Okay, so my essay is more of a meander, really, that sort of follows several touch points in the way BTS sort of navigates post-Cold War, the post-Cold War landscape of entertainment. So BTS as a group actually also, like amongst all their sort of prolific art and music work, they participate in all these reality shows, and one of those is a 4-season travelogue, basically. And one of the seasons takes place in Hawaii. And as a scholar of tourism, militarism, and U.S. empire, that was a really interesting moment for me. And so I just sort of watched. I think I was texting Michelle all my reactions or something at some point, like, "Ooh, what's happening here?" Right? But this is Bon Voyage, and they're on vacation in Hawaii, but they're on vacation but still working because they're getting filmed, right? That they're producing content even as they are on supposed leisure, and so that speaks to the sort of like nonstop nature of idol work, which I think about as part of a larger or broader category of entertainment care work in the Pacific. And there's a moment here, and when this hula dancer comes out, so they go to the Polynesian Cultural Center, and there's a moment where they're watching the dancers, and V says, "Oh, this is it, right? She's going to do the thing, basically." And it's this moment where they recognize both the effectiveness of the fantasy, right? That the dancer who is dancing in this context of Hawaii tourism, it has idol-like characteristics. They call her, she could be an idol in Hawaii, in Korea, right? Like she's got this charismatic eyes and like, she knows what they're doing. But they also recognize the labor, right, it takes to put that show together, right? And so in that moment, there are these two sort of sets of entertainers in one space, right? That is filmed for the entertainment of us as a fandom. And it was just so meta, right? It really made me think about the co-location of these two sets of entertainers within a regional post-Cold War circuit of gendered, racialized entertainment work, right? That exists for a variety of reasons, right? One, it's tied to the rise of tourism as a low infrastructure, culture as commodity extraction kind of industry, where the state gets to translate itself, right, to the rest of the world through like a cultural framework. And then it's also tied to the deep militarization of the region, right? And there's even further sort of layers in which these two kinds of post-Cold War mobilities sort of reinforce themselves, right? The entertainment of the troops, right, happens through an American repertoire of entertainment that's put together and danced by folks who are not necessarily American, right, in these various U.S. bases. And of course, there's the gendered, sexualized care work, right, of sex work around different kinds of military bases. And so that just kind of made me think about those relationships between like the existence of BTS, right, and the emergence of BTS as a kind of cultural phenomenon that we can't really separate from these larger other kinds of care work in the region. And it made me think about the sort of geopolitical terrain of this labor. So it's not like there's like a logic to my essay. I sort of chose different moments that sort of flared up, right, as sort of interesting crisis moments that I could notice as both a fan and a scholar of this work. And on March 2021, you're deep in the throes of COVID, we have the Atlanta shootings, right? And this is when BTS, so one of their two sort of like really vocal political moments happen in conjunction with U.S. race politics, right? One is sort of a solidarity statement with a BLM, and this moment in 2021, which becomes the most tweeted tweet of, and I'm still going to say tweet, of the year, right? And they're basically joining in with a whole conversation around the hashtag Stop Asian Hate movement that's happening, right? Again, as a result of Trump 1.0's sort of Asian COVID flu mutterings. But if we remember, right, 6 out of the 8 folks who were murdered in Atlanta were Asian, and 4 of them were Korean. BTS doesn't actually say anything about the Koreans, but we know that that's why they said anything, right? So they talk about why what it was like to be Asian in the world, and how as Asians they too had felt the sort of racial animus directed towards them, even though they were successful entertainers all throughout wherever they had been. But one thing they didn't kind of lean into was the gendered nature of entertainment care work, right? Even as men, they are extremely feminized, right, within this sort of framework. And they didn't really go into why there were 4 Korean women in Atlanta working as masseuses, right? And there is a history for that, right? There's a deep sort of military U.S. South Korea relationship that structures that history. So they don't go into that, but the reason that they're there is because a lot of these women had brokered marriages with American troops, and when some of the troops left South Korea, they went back to the South, and that's why there are South Korean masseuses in Atlanta, right? Because I was like, what are they doing in Atlanta? What is this whole phenomenon about? So they end up there, and what's also happening, right, is in South Korea, because a lot of this population is leaving, has left and gone elsewhere, right, to follow the drum, really, right? There's now a different kind of visa that's been created. It's an E6 visa that allows workers specifically serving U.S. troops, right, under the tourism law to come in to supplement the absence of South Korean entertainers. So those are Filipinas, those are Russians, Uzbeks, and Kazakh women who are then kind of brought in to supplement that absence. So there are these kind of really interesting ways in which, thinking through BTS allowed me to think about all these connections. And during the sort of waning days, although we're still really in the middle of the pandemic and we're all in denial about it, right? When BTS was getting ready to go into the military, right, and tourism was starting to open back up in South Korea, the third moment that made me think about all these different circuits was the Busan concert, right, in 2022, was it? Where BTS was sort of conscripted in a way to make the case, right, like sort of the beauty pageant show for the world to consider Busan as a site for the World Expo in 2030, right? I'm clearly still jet lagged. And it was just this, like BTS has basically functioned as a representative of South Korean tourism, right? They are the face, as much as like the hula girl is the face these days, right? Of tourism in Hawaii. And so it made me think about all the different ways in which this kind of labor is essential to the state, right? But in that moment of the concert, you also saw all these fans coming in because they knew it would be BTS's last live concert for a while. And people were coming from all over the world because it was a free concert too, right? It was a free concert and with like hundreds, I think you were there. There were hundreds of thousands, of people. Only a few, like a fraction of that could fit into the stadium. And it really showed like the sort of hunger for this kind of connection, right? And you can imagine so many of those people themselves in their lives providing care work, right, in various kinds of capacities. And it made me think about like the potential, right, in thinking about this kind of labor and the kind of political weight it can have in the world and the kind of abolitionist future building it can generate. So that was my essay.
Thank you. So now we want to give you all a chance to ask questions. As you are thinking about what you want to ask us, I thought I might kick us off here. Both of you mentioned, what BTS meant to a lot of Army during the first Trump presidency. And the work that Army did really, right? A lot of the sort of activist work that happened during the pandemic. We all, of course, are still reeling from Tuesday's election. It's heavy on all of our minds. So what can BTS offer us in this current political moment for the Trump 2.0 era, as it were?
So I'm actually teaching this book in a freshman seminar, and the last class was on Tuesday. And then I said, I'll see you next week, right? And the last 2 weeks, we've been reading a set of essays around sort of geopolitics and activism and BTS, right? Like trying to get the students to understand the ways in which different kinds of Army fandoms situated in different parts of the world have used BTS as both material and message, right, for their specific political concerns. So I'll just kind of talk about 3 of those essays because they really sort of illustrate how Army, in particular authoritarian states, right, gathered together. And I thought, like, if there's anything we can take from this, right, like why does BTS matter after Tuesday, right, for us here, is that people have been doing this work, right, already, and we can find a template and a connection with those kinds of places. So Carlina Octaviani writes about Indonesia and the kind of digital activism that the BTS fandom took on when this particular omnibus law passed or was going to pass. And Carlina actually, so one of the reasons we rushed through the publication of this book, like this was a really fast process, is because that law kicks in at the end of this year, and anything published past this year might endanger her, right? So her essay is a critique of that authoritarian government in Indonesia. And so she said, it has to be published in 2024 because after that, I could get into political trouble for this, right? And so, but she tells the story of how Indonesian fandom came together to really use sort of like their digital networks and their digital skills to message how bad this bill was going to be for Indonesian people, right? Not just sort of like the deregulation, the stripping away of environmental protections, the increase of state surveillance, right? But like the ways in which they use like fandom memes, like the language of the fandom to translate a political, what might be a jargony political message into like bits and bytes that people could understand was like a really useful thing. Although, they also talk about how that might, in the essay talks a little bit about the nuances of what that might do. And then I'll talk about one other essay. Because it's kind of really related, right? So there's an essay written by 3 Filipino activists who were reflecting on the last election in the Philippines, right? And the ways in which the K-pop fandom that they were talking about themselves as BTS fans came together to use the digital sort of savvy, the merch savvy, all the kinds of ways in which a fandom sort of congeals and solidifies its connection to each other to fight against the misinformation campaign of the Marcos regime, right? That was being put into service post Duterte with the election campaign of Marcos Jr. And so, these 3 activists talk a lot about how the Philippines is sort of like the laboratory of digital misinformation, right? We see this with like the work that Maria Ressa has done. But they talk about how, they use Facebook pages, they use different kinds of methods to push back against the kinds of misinformation that the Marcos Jr.'s campaign took part in. And they lost that election, right? And so I'm kind of going to go back to that essay to find like moments of like, what can we take away from that? Like in this moment of bleakness for us where, many of us feel like there's another election loss that's a really similar one. We're going to have a pretty authoritarian government here. And one of the bits of hope was really about the involvement of the youth, right? Like the intergenerational recognition that this is a long slog. This is a long slog, but that the recognition, right, between like one generation to another was a really kind of important part of that story. So I'll end there.
Yeah. Well, so I definitely feel that I feel a sense of deja vu. I'm sure a lot of us are in that position. And I actually, when I was on my way here, I was thinking like it's really helping me that this event is happening, and I'm remembering the way that my own fandom of BTS and my interest in studying what the fandom was doing was a way for me to deal with what was going on around me during Trump 1.0. And it's a kind of reminder that, there are these kind of counter forces that we need to encourage and support. And again, a reminder, like, don't just throw up your hands. I think that there's something interesting about the way that BTS's status as a group kind of went from underdog to kind of dominant figure in this very commercial industry. And that has been quite interesting to observe the way that fans are starting to become kind of critics and watchdogs of the industry. And I think that that's really important, the kind of critical energies around being able to hold space for contradictory ideas about K-pop as an industry, HYBE as a corporate entity, and the values and goals of a fandom that's not just in it to help BTS chart the highest so that they can be the dominant figures in a commercial pop music industry is really, it's inspiring, and it's something that I think we can really think about more. And so to see that kind of complexity enter into fan conversations is really helpful because I think we just need more and more of that.
So actually, I'm wearing a shirt that has a piece of art from the book.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this tension that Michelle, I think you just referred to between the kind of liberating, transgressive aspects of BTS as a kind of cultural phenomenon that goes beyond Korea, and the thinking about BTS as this corporate product. Especially, I'm thinking within the last year, probably since you wrote the book, all of this news has come out about Hybe, very kind of ugly, sordid details about how that corporation has been run, very ugly details about its CEO. And on the one hand, a lot of those things have nothing to do with BTS if we're thinking about, its members. But on the other hand, they have everything to do with BTS if we're thinking about them as this corporate product that was marketed in a certain way and became successful because of the strategies that Hybe as a corporation used to promote them. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that tension or the contradictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been thinking about all of these things too. So, I mean, one place that I start is that BTS have always been multiple things at once. So even when they were seen as underdogs in the K-pop industry or, not coming from one of the big three entertainment companies and struggling to get distribution or spots on weekly live TV shows and stuff, they still were, part of that machine. And so K-pop is the dominant commercial like pop music culture in East and Southeast Asia. It doesn't have necessarily this liberatory or transgressive or subcultural significance. Even though fan strategies can be deployed for political actions, that is a constant tension and dialectic. So it's not as though only in recent months the industry significance of BTS has come to overshadow their larger significance. It's been there from the start, right? And so I think that part of what we're trying to do in this book is to expand what BTS is. It's not just one thing, because what you determine a phenomenon to be can only that meaning can only emerge in a specific place and time, right? So contexts differ. So yeah, what is subculture in one place is totally mainstream in another. this comes through, I think, in Heijin's essay as well. What is read into or projected onto a set of signs or signifiers is going to enable different imaginations or ways of defying norms in a particular place versus another. And that isn't something to be dismissed, right? Like there really are these new possibilities that are signaled when you just shift the lens because you're looking at a different social and geographical context. But yeah, I think Hybe, I do think that there's something about Hybe, which is, the entity that Big Hit Entertainment kind of reorganized into in 2020, late 2021 or early 2022. It represented the expansion of an entertainment company concept that included like many other kind of sectors. It was this new vision of what an entertainment company could be, which was really something more like a tech company. It was actually out of the development of the live streaming concert technology that a lot of the capital for Hybe's reorganization actually was secured. And since then, the management of Hybe has been really interested in kind of joining with gaming companies, with like kind of diversifying into all of these other aspects of K content, so that ultimately, like the risk of the success or failure of a particular idol group will be, held not necessarily by Hybe, but by all of these subunits or smaller entities. And so I think it does mark a change in what Big Hit was. It's this kind of corporate vision that I don't think is necessarily there when BTS was conceived. So I wanted to say that, not to defend them necessarily, because they are still part of the same thing. But nonetheless, yeah, we as fans have to grapple with what we're doing when we're trying to like buy more stuff, and in that way try to gain visibility for the group, because we're feeding directly into that corporate machine that's also doing a lot of work to commodify what Koreanness is, what Korean culture is. That has a deleterious effect, I think, and we're seeing that. So yeah, there's like just a lot that we have to keep in mind at the same time that we're joyful and coming together in community around our appreciation of these groups. I think one hopeful space is that Big Hit as an entity was generally responsive to fan criticisms. I think that's shifted with Hybe because clearly there are a lot of, fan criticisms, boycott Hybe. Army for Palestine is like a really important force in trying to kind of bring to light what kind of violence goes into these corporate organizations. And so, yeah, I'm really curious to see what's going to happen when BTS reconvene, which is happening fairly soon, and how the company will have to respond to fans at that point, I think. So there's some hope. And so K-pop as an industry has often been more responsive to fan criticism, fan kind of viewpoints, because it's so interested in cultivating fan parasocial commitments. And so as a consequence, I think more than maybe other media cultures, there is this feedback built in. So it's kind of up to us to kind of tell the industry to kind of intervene more, because that space is open.
Hi, thank you so much for your eye-opening talks. I can't wait to read the whole anthology. Heijin, I've always been really interested in how K-pop idols are gendered and racialized. And, you touched on the productive and at the same time kind of fetishistic projections about Jimin, but by extension, I think just K-pop in general, and again, by extension, Koreans. And I'm also thinking about how on the Korean internet, there are sometimes, people watching reaction videos of American fans or international fans, like watching, BTS videos, and there will be comments from Koreans saying like, 국뽕이 차오른다, like I'm getting nation meth injected into my bloodstream, like they're getting a kind of nationalism euphoria, right? And I'm wondering if you have any observations about how the globalization of K-pop feeds into Koreans' self fantasy. That's the end of the question.
I'm still thinking about nation meth. That's a really great question. It makes me think about my own parents, and when we're watching Korean television together, and I mean, every single time BTS comes up in Korean news or American news or television, they'll be like, "Look at what we did. Look at what we did," and I'm like, "We did this." My parents are like 80 years old, right? They've lived in the U.S. for, my goodness, over 50 years, right? But there is this notion of a we that overcame the war, right? And then the poverty after the war and, all the subsequent obstacles that, and by we mean South Korea, of course, right? Only. To become this kind of global force. And so there is this reflection, right? So in my piece, I'm thinking about how is it that North American Army is understanding BTS and what attracts them to it. I think then what Michelle said is really important to note, that the way that Korean youth are responding to BTS is totally different, right? Most Korean youth are not looking at Jimin being like, that's Jimin gender, right? They would be like, what? What is that? Because it is quite normative, right? It's like someone looking at Britney Spears and being like, wow, she's so radical. And then but then I think, Emily, what you're pointing out is but then there is this other way in which there is a self-reflection that Korean people and and I can't speak to like the demographics of it, but certainly I know at least of an older generation, there is quite a bit of pride, right? That there's that we again, right? We have redeemed ourselves on the global stage. And quite often it's very racist, right? Like my dad will say like, oh, did you know that we used to have the same, GDP as the Philippines, but not anymore, right? And so this is a really interesting way that mark the progress of a nation. And I think, it makes me want to watch the reaction videos. But I know that, it also makes me think, I often give lectures about the way in which U.S. imperialism is quite imbricated in the K-pop industry, right? That we can't really talk about the success of K-pop on a global scale without talking about U.S. neocolonialism in Korea and, the ways in which these industries sort of grew up under the tutelage of the U.S. and American capitalism. And I will always have someone at that talk raise their hand and be like, are you saying that Korea can't do anything by itself, right? Like this very like offended position. And I think all of those things are kind of related. So thank you for the question.
I would just add, I guess, that because I've seen a lot of those reaction videos. Actually, it's a whole genre actually of Korean YouTubers who repost like American or European reactions to Korean content with Korean subtitles. And then the comment section is like, so many comments that are like, oh, I'm so proud. And that fascination with what other people think of Korea. So, with so many, Hallyu products, their popularity domestically will increase exponentially once it's deemed like viral or popular abroad. So it's kind of like there's always this displaced consciousness of trying to, or not being able to make a judgment until you find out what the West thinks or something like that. I see this as like, this is the post-colonial conundrum, this fact that there's just this constant education of people that they should be modern, that they should care about development or where South Korea is in a developmental race. And it's drilled into people from, the very beginnings of their consciousness, right? And so it's part of this kind of circumstance in which that idea of external judgment is it's a product of the geopolitical situation. So you can't fault people for that, right? It's almost this kind of like sense of national survival at all times, right? It's just, how do we kind of get out of that? And it's not just by becoming a media hegemon and then now making everyone else wonder if they're meeting the Korean standard. But unfortunately, that is what the kind of media industries kind of aspire to, especially regionally, right? So it's not just, I think, with Korean media or Hallyu, but all other kind of scales of development. But it's part of this like larger world in which we live, where that is the measure of the value of a culture or a people, right?
We do have a book giveaway for the best question that is asked today. So I have a free book. And we're going to have Heijin make the call of who asked the best question because she is the queen.
And you can ask any questions. Any and all questions are welcome.
Yes, absolutely.
Hi, I am an ethnomusicologist, so I'm interested in terms of the sound that BTS produced. You talk about all this different intertextual, translation of the image or even the gender persona. So I'm interested in the, in terms of the Jimin gender, do people talk about the vocality of the BTS, the kind of sound they produce that will, is it considered as feminized or is it considered as a Jimin gender voice? What is that? So I'm curious about that. Thank you.
That's a really great question. I didn't look into that specifically, but I do know that, Jimin is really, beloved for his sweet, high-pitched voice, right? That is very melodic, feminized. So, I would venture to say that is part of Jimin gender. Michelle.
Totally. His like timbre, the tonal quality of his voice is always kind of so distinctive because he has an androgynous voice. And he actually is a stronger singer, I think, in the higher registers. So that comes through in some of the like concert footage and stuff. Like he really excels in that, in singing the high notes and stuff like that. But it took him a long time actually to come to accept that. So I think that part of his growth, it's illustrated in that fan art of like, so he started off as a dancer and didn't really have any musical training or any musical kind of skills. So they thought that they would make him a rapper because this is also like BTS's trajectory as like, hip hop idols to, I mean, they still are that. The rap line is like renowned in the K-pop industry for being really skilled rappers, lyricists, but they also have this other dimension of, a different type of pop music. So they're really kind of expanding their range. But yeah, Jimin was supposed to be a rapper, but that wasn't his skill set. And so I think it's kind of great that he discovered his talent for singing, especially a kind of pop style. But that wasn't the intent initially. Like the macho, masculine kind of image of BTS from their beginnings was something that Jimin felt he had to embody, and then only later when their concept changed, did some other possibilities arise, and that's when he really took off. His star kind of went, and now so many people are enchanted by, the kind of masculinity he represents.
I'll jump in because I know nothing about this question really, but I have watched an inordinate number of reaction videos by vocal coaches of Jimin. So I just watch them and I get so much pleasure in the way that they break down his voice and how well he sings at that register. And they really note that sort of particular, ethereal quality to the high tones in his voice. And I don't know why that gives me so much pleasure, but I watch those videos. I could watch the actual videos, but I watch people watching him. And that's also some kind of other phenomenon, right?
I don't know quite how to ask this, but it relates to, Vernadette, what you were just talking about in terms of watching these videos, right, and getting pleasure out of them. But I remember when you came back from going to your BTS concert, right, and about just how wonderful it was. And, so I'm wondering if when all of you are working on this, if you can think about, or if what I'm going to say makes any sense, that, growing up, and I think maybe it's because I'm much older than any of you, that growing up in this sort of patriarchal American culture, I had a vision of masculinity that I think was a little different from maybe you, younger generations. But I'm wondering if your work on BTS and then thinking about the army and just the incredible energy behind it, if you can talk about how the audience members can be transformed and take on a different sense of beauty and masculinity through this work, and how it's psychically very, very empowering, especially in being a woman of color or a person of color in the United States. And I don't know if any of this makes sense to you, but can you talk about it?
There's a number of essays in the volume that actually really drill down to that idea. So there's an essay about skinship in BTS, and it's written by somebody who has a disability where she has an aversion to touch. It makes her ill, right? But she some other kinds of disabilities too that she discusses as part of her story, and that being able to see BTS and the way they're all really touchy-feely with each other in a really comfortable, natural way gives her this really incredible sense of comfort. Like she can experience it by proxy, and she can see a model of masculinity that's really different and sustaining, and and so there's that kind of I think way in which that kind of plays out in that essay. And I would say yeah, so actually one of our other co-editors, Ronnie Neutel, writes an essay about being 45 and like falling in lust with BTS and like it was one of the pieces that really talks about them as a sort of objective desire, right? Like this, like, wow, it's not about I want to be Jimin, I want to do BTS. Like, that was like the whole point. But then it kind of thinks through how the fandom on these older women that she interviewed, because she interviewed a whole bunch of like sort of women in their 40s and 50s and 60s, right, who like love BTS, right? Like they're hard stands. So some of you might know what that means. It's like hardcore stands, like a sexually desiring stan. Found a liberation in that kind of desire for Asian men, right? Like who weren't the sort of stereotypical masculine kind of subject, right? And a lot of them sort of like veered towards that because it was this really like different, it was like an alternative to what they had seen before and experienced in their own relationships, right? And so BTS becomes this sort of like other kind of possibility. And so like all these women that she interviewed kind of like were in some pretty dysfunctional relationships with men, heterosexual relationships, and found alternative ways to think about what might be a healthier relationship. And so that was really kind of interesting.
I would just add that, Michelle and I met at a K-Con, which is like, Comic-Con for K-pop, right? And it was at the Staples Center in 2019. And I was so overwhelmed by the fact that it was all Black and brown young people. One might at that time especially think it would be all Asian Americans, right? But it was all Black and brown youth who, found community in one another and within these fandoms, and particularly felt excluded or marginalized in their school or in their community, felt like the oddball out, and yet found not only K-pop or BTS, but each other on the internet, right? And formed these really strong bonds. And so I think there are many ways that K-pop serves as these spaces where people are not only transformed, but, find connection and community. One last contender for the best question of the day.
In terms of pleasure and desire that has been mentioned by Vernadette and your question, all these essays that have been put together, can they capture the pleasure and desire of the BTS? Or is it trying to, as intellectuals, us being in the academe, it's phenomenal, right? And are we dancing yet? Or are we giving ourselves more time to dance?
So I think we wanted to be able to offer just a selection of what different worlds and different experiences BTS has kind of made possible. We definitely wanted to produce a text that could offer people with different sets of interests, like different ways in. So we try to make it like different than a typical academic volume so that you can find that joy or reflections of the kind of joy that people find in BTS. And I think I don't know, we like this kind of project always falls short, right? But our intention was very much to offer that to readers. And so it was our hope that we could do that.
I think there's also a way that all of the pieces grapple with the tension between that joy and desire, fandom, and like, yeah, this is a phenomenon we're, at the very least, intellectually invested in, but some of us are also emotionally invested in, but also like that place of critique, right, of the object that you might love, right, and how you can balance those things when you're thinking through the kinds of critical lenses that you're bringing to the table. And so that was, I think that comes across in quite a few of the pieces. But I think where the love really comes through is like the fan art insert, which we didn't really get to talk about today. But the fan art insert really shows the ways in which the fandom sort of, creates and produces more, right? Some new things on top of what BTS gets them to start thinking about. And a lot of that fan art is also produced in projects of mutual aid, right? Especially during COVID, or critique, or, right? And so there are ways in which they operate already on that sort of other level, right? It's not just joy and love, but joy and love that is like a constructive joy and love.
Thank you all for spending this afternoon with us, especially on this rainy day, for making it out here. I guess I should announce the best question winner. I think for asking, are we dancing yet? Is there a better question that we should all be asking ourselves every day? Are we dancing yet? I don't know your name, but Eva, please come get your book. So we are actually selling books out here now.
Be careful. Thank you. And just incidentally, every single cent that the book makes goes and supports an LGBTQ youth shelter in Seoul. Right. So every single stocking stuffer people, right?
It's the perfect holiday gift.
It's the perfect gift to support like the youth culture that has really given rise to this phenomenon. So thank you for supporting us.
Please stay, buy a book, and there are refreshments in the hallway. Thank you again.